Over the next 2 weeks, we will be studying the work of Edgar Allan Poe. Specifically, we will be looking at two selections, The Fall of the House of Usher and The Raven. Because both of these selections are fairly long and require a great deal of reading and analysis, you will have 2 weeks to look at them. Before you begin reading, I think it's important for you to have some background information on the author, which you did get by reading the author profile. However, I'd like to go a little bit more in depth into some of these areas and provide you with a little bit more perspective on both Poe's work, what was going on in America during this time, as well as the specific selections that we'll be reading. The first thing that I would like to talk about is the author's work. What is interesting about Poe's writing is that it contains a fascinating duality. In some instances, he displays a great sensitivity. For instance, in his poem Annabel Lee, where he longs for his lost love, he's very sensitive to those feelings. In other instances of his writing, they're much darker and eerie, where he presents these dark escapes from reality. These are probably the stories from Poe that you are much more used to reading, such as The Pit and the Pendulum, The Telltale Heart, and The Fall of the House of Usher, which we'll be reading this week, falls into that category. Poe is credited as being the inventor of the detective story. Although we don't always find out who did it in his stories, he presents these clues along the way that can lead you to questioning your narrator and your main characters and to their involvement in the various deceits and crimes committed. He's also considered the leading pioneer of the modern thriller. His work, although by some of today's standards may not be as gory as we would consider thrillers to be, they did keep people on their edge of their seat. And even today, a good Poe storyteller can keep an audience on their feet as they share these works. The other thing about his work is that he explored the dark possibilities of the individual. Many other authors of the time were exploring self-reliance, and instead he was interested in exploring the individual and the individual's mind, even if that mind was warped by obsession and grief, which are both themes that seem to be very prevalent throughout much of his writing. Some interesting things about the writer in his time. He lived during a period of great American expansion. During this time, we were adding land, and the Louisiana Purchase, the acquisition of Texas, those kinds of things made America, the United States, become a much larger area to cover. Also, while he was alive, the population more than tripled. The year he was born, the population of the United States was 7 million. 1 year after he died in 1850, it was more than 21 million. So we were seeing an enormous increase in the number of people in this country. Because of these things and industrialization, cities grew. Overnight, we would have increases in the size of our cities, and transportation increased. We were creating an amazing system of canals throughout some cities, and railroads were connecting the east coast of our country over to the west coast, which made travel much easier and allowed people to move throughout this vast area that we had. It was also at this time that the foundation of classic American literature was laid. Around the beginning of Poe's writing, international authors would make jokes about, who reads American literature? Nobody. But it was around this time that people throughout the world did begin to embrace American literature as being one, American, and two, having something important to say. Um, and it became truly what we consider to be classic literature today. We're talking about authors such as Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and of course Poe himself would lay this foundation. You've already read about Poe's life, or you will read about Poe's life, and the struggles that every author has, and his personal troubles with the death of his family, his wife, which really many people attribute to the darkness inside in his writing, because he was feeling tormented by all of these things around him. However, what many people have focused on over the years is actually the mysteriousness that surrounds Poe's death. So he did die a mysterious death. On September 28, 1849, Poe was found unconscious outside of a Baltimore inn. He was dressed in ill-fitted and tattered clothes. So this means that the clothing he was wearing, they're not sure belonged to him, and in addition, the shoes that he had on were way too big. He died a couple days, couple days later, on October 7th, in a hospital in Baltimore, never having regained consciousness or been able to explain how he ended up there. Because of this, no one knows how he got there or what led to the condition and his eventual death. Some believe that he was out binge drinking and just, got into a fight or just collapsed. Others believe that he was mugged or possibly kidnapped and then thrown in front of the inn. There's been a question of whether he had a disease such as cholera, and some have attributed it to rabies because of the exotic pets that he kept. But nothing has been conclusive, and nobody's ever able to narrow down what actually caused his death. One of the interesting things about Poe is that after his death, he has continued to permeate culture, specifically our pulp culture, our current culture today, and he's considered by some to be a pop icon, even though normally that's reserved for musicians and movie stars. But he pops up all over the place in our culture, even today. The Beatles, he is mentioned in their song I Am the Walrus, and he's also pictured on the front of their Sgt. Pepper album. Many musicians, such as Iron Maiden, Good Charlotte, and Green Day, have written songs related to Poe and his writings. A 1990 Halloween episode of The Simpsons was based upon The Raven, and they actually give him credit as one of their writers at the end of the episode. There's been very many movies based on his stories, and if you do a search of the internet for any of them, many of them you can still find today. And nothing, of course, is as much pulp culture as football in America. And the Baltimore Ravens chose the Raven, one of the main characters of Poe's famous poem, The Raven, as their mascot, and it's displayed all over Baltimore and on anything and everything that you can imagine. So you can see that Poe's importance throughout our culture, not just as a writer, has influenced his icon status throughout many other areas. Specifically at the two stories that we will be reading over the next two weeks. The first one is The Fall of the House of Usher. A little bit about the story. It is truly a journey into a decaying mind. And I don't mean decaying in the sense of the guy's dead and his brain's rotting, but rather the loss of sanity. And that's how you should view the main character, Roderick Usher. The narrator, who doesn't get a name, visits a boyhood friend during an illness. And when he shows up at the mansion to visit his friend, the mansion itself is already in an eerie kind of state of decrepitness. Roderick Usher is the narrator's boyhood friend, and when the friend gets there, the narrator, he realizes that Roderick is in a very fragile mental and physical health. He is not well at all. What we learn throughout the story is that the apparent death of Usher's twin sister leads to days of torment. And because of this torment over his sister's death, there's an unlikely and suspenseful kind of thriller ending to the story. So make sure, even though it's long, you get to the end, find out what's going on. The second story or selection we'll be looking at this week is The Raven. It is Poe's most famous and most successful work. Many of his other works he did not see success with until after his death or after they'd been published many, many times. But The Raven, because of its style, was an instant success. Some interesting things about The Raven: it is very multi-level. On one level, it's most simply about a man who grieves for his lost love, Lenore. As he's grieving, a raven shows up at his window. He talks to the raven, and when he asks the raven if he's ever going to see her again, the raven simply replies, "Nevermore." So that's kind of the surface story, as he's grieving out loud about this lost love. The second level is this exploration of how grief and loneliness can turn to madness. And because he's grieving and he knows that he'll never see her again, he begins to lose his sanity. And so when you look at it at a deeper level, you're going to see that turn to madness. Which relates to the fact that this poem really depicts a mind falling to pieces. He's losing his sanity. He's losing touch with reality. Okay. Hopefully this information has given you a little bit broader view of Poe, his work, the time in which he was writing, its influence on us today, and a little bit into the stories that you're going to be reading before you begin reading them. Please don't forget to answer the 5 comprehension questions that are listed below this video to make sure that you receive credit for viewing it. Thank you. Have a good week.